Welcome to this very special Simply Sarah. I am so glad that you are here for this conversation. I'm Sarah Stockham, your host. And we start by saying thank you to the Stegner family and Lamana Art for their incredible support, as well as to Angela Saucedo. Angela, we are thrilled to be on your schedule to find time for this amazing conversation. Welcome, my dear friend.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
We've been having conversations in Simply Sarah about resilience, and this is something that you know so much about. I would love for you to share some of how you got to where you are today, being so influential in the state of California and what's taking place with foster children and other situations. Would just love for you to take it away. I'm going to actually take myself out of the picture so that the listeners can just enjoy hearing your story.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I sort of got in or around child welfare sort of by accident and not accident. I think my own personal life, my own trauma, my own neglect and abuse in my own home probably allowed me an opportunity to sort of look through and be in child welfare with a very unique lens. And I don't know if I would imagine many of my colleagues are probably in the same boat, where we sort of got into this field because we wanted to give a voice to children. We wanted, perhaps in our own way, we didn't have that. And so wanted to really ensure that there were other children that would be able to have that voice. But many times people ask, how did you become a social worker? And I often sort of think, well, it's a whole bunch of like things that happened in life. And I'm not sure whether or not it's nature or nurture, that debate, but it definitely comes from my own personal trauma, my own personal childhood, and then a series of amazing human beings that guided me and that sort of showed up in my life at various times when I didn't know I needed them. And I think it really speaks to this universal sort of push as to what it is that we might be called to do. And many social workers my colleagues who work with me feel that way, that there's something about this particular work that allows us and needs us to be vulnerable, allows us to lean in and dig into conversations and spaces that maybe for a lot of people are really uncomfortable, but also it allows us to build this enormous amount of compassion and a capacity for compassion. So I'm really grateful for all of those individuals, whether they knew or didn't know, that sort of came into my life. And I was grateful that at that time and all of those times that I was willing to sort of step forward. And I know that our conversation today will really focus around resiliency and how sometimes taking a leap of faith into the unknown, and then sometimes someone pushing you out of the way, literally, in order for you to be able to sort of find your way.
Angela, that is such an incredible beginning to our conversation, because you are right. People do show up in our lives who have intentionality in their own life and in their own actions, and that the timing of it is just this beautiful piece that's woven together, right? And and for you to be willing in those spaces to take that leap of faith into the next step. You went to college, you went back for your master's and got it in yoga. And how have you found helping people who are in places of being given the opportunity to grow in their own resilience? How has yoga been part of that conversation that's been helpful?
Oh, I could not imagine a life without it. And I think it found me. I often say I didn't find yoga. Yoga found me in a space that I was able to receive it. I was training for the LA Marathon, and I was taking a kickboxing class to build endurance. And the teacher it was in a community center, And the teacher said, I teach yoga. And at that time, I didn't know what that was. And I just felt like, oh, you kind of sit around and people chant. And I'm not really quite sure that that's for me because, right, I was, I'm
Active.
runner.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm active, like sitting around. And I also think too, given I was in child welfare and kind of the pace of that and the chaoticness of that and kind of what was also happening in my own life as well, somewhere in my late 20s and 30s, I didn't really piece that together, that I needed a space for rest, that I needed to sort of take a moment to stop surviving in life and helping people sort of survive their traumatic experiences, but to also have a space for rest. And again, this really active sport of running, which is amazing, was still really active. It was still really fiery. And I needed something that was sort of more calming to my soul. And I decided I would take her up on the class. She said it was free. And I said, free, and I'm already dressed. And I took my first yoga class and instantly was like, there's something that really resonates to me about this spirit, mind, body connection.
Yes.
And I share this story always. There was a gentleman, and he was probably maybe in his 60s, maybe older, and flowed through this combination, of asana with just such grace and ease. And I thought, here I was, this young person, but I didn't have the flexibility. And now I recognize both mind, spirit, and body. And I also didn't have this sense of peace and grace in strenuous or in difficult situations, right? I was always sort of fighting and fixing. And I was just so drawn to the practice. And so it sort of led me on a very long journey of having my own practice, becoming a teacher, really being exposed to the various elements of yoga, including bhakti yoga, which spoke to me because it was this idea of devotion to the practice and to myself, and kirtan and music, and it just wasn't this one thing. And so, I became a teacher, and I was teaching for a while, and then I decided, I'm going to own a yoga studio. And so I went in partnership with someone for about 3 to 5 years and owned a yoga studio, but I still had my regular county job as a child welfare worker.
Right.
And it was actually then that I started to see that these differences as students were coming in voluntarily, coming into the studio, kind of, I think in some ways, understanding that they may too need that sense of grace or rest. And I was teaching in my office, so I was allowed to sort of offer that in my office. And what I found was that my colleagues were coming with more significant physical, emotional, and spiritual trauma. And that there was a brokenness that was very different that maybe what I would see in a studio. And it's not to say it didn't exist, but I think that those that were willing to sort of go into that space kind of were seeking in some way. But here it was sort of like, we're going to try to release stress. And it was afterwards, and those classes kind of continued on, it was people saying, I'm sleeping better, or, I'm not taking my anti-anxiety medication, or, it was a place for somebody who, was gay, and it was a space for them to be able to express themselves. And so, right, with no judgment, and again, in a space that was my employment. And so it started me sort of to think that there was a connection there, and I wanted to learn more about it. And so I took the next leap, and Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles was offering their inaugural class of a master's in yoga studies. And everyone asked, a real degree? I was like, yes, a real accredited degree from LMU, and jumped in. And again, it's all of those connections and people, and again, faith. I happened to get a supervisor and a manager who had found yoga in his own journey and said, we'll figure it out, right? So I was able to sort of do those two things, and so continue to be in child welfare as well as be going to school full time. The beauty of that was I was allowed, because at that time I'd sort of gotten out of the field and was doing more community-based work, was to have that as an offering and building connections in our communities and beginning to heal healers and beginning to validate how difficult and noble and amazing this job is, but also kind of being able to share what it is that I had learned with those that were also in the same trenches, so to speak, or in the same field. And it was such a blessing because, you know, it taught me so much, but it was such an amazing blessing because, again, it was the perfect timing. It was the perfect boss. It was the perfect, you know, the inaugural class. The schedule fit with my life. And I sort of took all of those principles of yoga and what we were learning and sort of integrated them in social work and psychology. I don't think that I could take that away. So being able to write and learn about different philosophies, but also how it connects with the psychology of today, social workers of today, and then how do we embrace and integrate that. And so now I do much more of an administrative and a special project. I am helping to develop our new child welfare system for the state of California as a subject matter expert because I've been doing this for about 30 years. Right. And I want to show this, though, Sarah, that I think that when I found that first class, which was the question, there was something that really spoke to me about the rest space that I was allowing myself. Someone was giving me 6 minutes at the end of class to not be responsible, to not hold trauma, to not hold, you know, the sacred stories, which later I learned I was storing in my body, just for those moments. And then, you know, class is over and we jump right back into the world. But I realized then, as I continued in my practice, that was what I really did need. I needed these continual spaces of space, of breath, of rest, of somebody saying it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay that we don't have it all right and all the answers. And in an organization that the public particularly views, right, that we have to have it right, and I get it. We're just human. We might not have all of the answers in the moment that we need to have them. I think the commitment is always that we will look for them and be curious about them. But I just want to show, like, for me, it really was, I needed that. I needed that space. I needed somebody to say it was okay. And so now that's actually what I do for my own business, and going into foster care agencies, going into agencies that work with our traumaed youth, going into and talking about these things, doing sound healing, meditation, breath work, talking about the science of it, because there's such an enormous value in the rest, right? And how do we continue to maintain empathy and compassion in this work? And we hear it a lot, right? This idea of burnout. We see it in the educational system and law enforcement, because we're working with and we're around human beings who are simply having their own traumas, their own suffering. And we receive that. And as healers, we want to fix it and we want to make it better, right? The space of compassion. But after a while and years and stories, if we do not allow ourselves that same compassion, I do think that the armor never comes off. You know, that we maintain that into our own personal lives.
I remember so clearly, we had met at Stanton Elementary School. You and Becky Villanueva were such good friends, right? And you would stop in, and I loved how you would challenge ideas that we just were like, this is how it is. And you would say, you know, I think there might be another way of doing. And then you were invited to come in and teach a class on a professional development day. And I could have stayed in your classroom the entire day. It was such a break for me as an educator who, at that point, felt like I was no longer part of a school because I was an itinerant teacher. And there is something that happens that's so precious in my experience when I was a teacher at Cullen, that we would have these staff meetings, we would do staff birthdays, there was just community. And I remember that was broken the very, very first day that I became an itinerant teacher. I had been told the day before school started that I had a place I could park in the parking lot at one of the elementary schools, and went that morning. And the secretary was out there. She peeled open the banana, stuck half of it in her mouth, which I totally get because she's on the clock, right? Has to get done, but she's got to have something to eat. And as she's chewing on her banana, she says to me, "You can no longer park in our parking lot." And the only other place then was either on the street completely full or across an incredibly busy street in a shopping parking lot. And I just remember pulling out of there and just thinking, this is what new teachers feel like. And somewhere in that space, you came in and uh, led us through a meditation. And it was so vivid for me to be able to let go, to release, to all of the, as you talk about the stories and the dramas and the traumas, all of those things, the expectations from other people that are no longer aspirations, but feel like a boot on the neck that you have to get done, that you have to meet someone else's expectation. And being able to just sit there and breathe. And I was completely transformed in that space of rest because I hadn't been resting. I hadn't been doing those things, taking care of myself. And knew you also to be a bodybuilder. And I thought, I don't have the time to do that. And then gloriously during the shutdown, somebody opened up an online yoga studio. And here we are 5 years later, and I'm still practicing with her online. And it has been that space. You're exactly right. That space of rest, of being able to take all of the expectations of what's supposed to happen today or over the next week that feels like all of it's on my list, or the part that's on my list feels so big. And to be able to say, I get to rest. I get to choose me. I get to choose a space where it's different, and that I can listen to things potentially different, that I can hear things in my body differently. And what a gift that space of rest is. And to me, it's one of the really important pillars in this journey that we call the journey of resilience. If we don't have these spaces of rest, there is a chance of deep depression and burnout. And so how amazing 6 minutes is, 3 minutes is, to be able to stop.
And for a long time, Sarah, I also taught meditation for various styles in somebody else's yoga studio, because I really also felt that the gift that I was given by being in child welfare was really meeting people where they're at, principle of social work. And we're not always going to have 6 minutes or be able to go online. We might have, our kids or a variety of different things happening that are distractions, and life, right? It's just life, right? The mundane parts of life. We have to go to the grocery store. We have to get gas. We have to do all of these things. But that didn't mean that there weren't moments that we could go ahead and give ourselves grace, give ourselves some space, learn how to maybe reset the brain and the mind for a moment before we go on to the next task or the next thing. And I feel like yoga in particular helps us to build that resiliency in life. I knew we were obviously going to be talking today, and started to think about this idea of resilience and how does yoga, mindfulness, meditation play into that in our own lives. And I started to think about how we also maybe many times don't acknowledge our own resiliency, that we believe that it needs to be this large hurdle that we've overcome. And for many, that is the case. But the common shared human experience is suffering, and nobody gets a pass. It would be great, but the reality is that that for me personally, the idea of learning and being human is that I will need to understand suffering, and that may be my own. Because that is the impetus to moving towards compassion, self-compassion for myself, but also for others, right? This idea that we can put ourselves in the shoes of another person, or again, compassion, the act to alleviate that suffering.
Yeah.
And so I kind of feel like many times on our journey in our life, on this idea of resilience, we don't allow ourselves to embrace that term enough in even maybe what seems to be small. And I don't want to, like, I'm not meaning to be like small in measure, but like I find that we compare our suffering, right?
Yeah.
Like my suffering isn't like Sarah's suffering. Sarah's suffering isn't like so and so suffering, but it is my own. And the more that I can understand where that comes from, then the more resilient I become, right? Or I see some, and so they don't have to be these large feats. And I think, again, that speaks to child welfare. When children, unfortunately are removed from the care of their parents and we're looking for measures of success, I feel like so many times the pressure has been that everything is perfect. But that isn't success. Success might be that this incident doesn't happen again, or a different approach is being taken in the future, or we can help to mitigate something, right? Especially in regards to a child's safety. That is success. That is resiliency. That is, turning the page and moving on. And sometimes it takes someone like myself and yourself in education. I was so blessed with amazing educators in my life, definitely, who were angels and guided the way for me. But like, you don't know who you are in that moment to someone.
Yeah.
Right, in their journey of resiliency. As I shared, becoming a social worker was really a whole bunch of people, whether they knew it or not. Social workers who came into my life that I didn't even know were social workers at the time. And educators who, pushed me or, maybe gave me attention in ways that I didn't receive at home. And so I feel like this idea of resiliency is also embracing that we embrace these small measures, because resiliency can then shift and begin to not come from a space of scarcity, which many times that is the case, right? We're resilient and we tackle over something. And so it's survival, right? It's a part of our brain that we need to do something. But I also feel like resiliency can be in a space of abundance, that we begin to shift our mindset and the lens of how we look at these sufferings or these incidences of trauma from not survival in scarcity, but really in abundance. That we begin to shift and start to think and give ourselves the pats on the back that we deserve for making it. Or whatever your field is. And I think, of course, in child welfare, it is an onslaught of trauma. But, that doesn't mean that that's not the case, again, for everyone, because I don't know everyone's life. And so for me, it really has always been, how do I now, with these tools and with this information, begin to heal healers? And Babette Rothschild wrote a really great book. It's Help the Helper, which is when I learned about compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma. And I think that that's great, right? How do we help the helper?
Yeah.
But my mind began to shift and think, no, I want to heal healers, because what we're doing is we're helping people on their healing journey. And I don't know that being a helper many times is, we want it to be a good thing, but sometimes healing doesn't feel like help. Sometimes healing is.
Let's just take a quick break right here. Let's take a quick break.
Okay, yeah.
Right afterwards, because this is a whole new conversation that I'm loving, and I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to get into that. We'll be right back.
Yeah.
Michelle. I am the founder and owner of Lamano Art.
I began this business over 20 years ago. I specialize in paintings of all kinds. I make murals, portraits, and live paintings. My specialty is color and also telling a story. Some of the work that Lamano Art does are calligraphy pieces, wedding invitations, sign work, and sculptures like fairy doors. I'm open to working with anyone on any idea.
Please feel free to contact me at your convenience, and I look so forward to talking to you. Thank you.
Angela, we are moving into this part of the conversation about helpers helping helpers. Such a brilliant way of saying it. And that whole idea of also of secondary stress of these pieces that we are beginning to see and have a larger conversation about. Would love for you to share more about what you have seen, what you are acknowledging, and what you are helping other people to see on their own resilient journey.
You know, I was so fortunate. I was able to write my thesis for LMU from a personal viewpoint because it hadn't been heard before. It's very, I think, unique in that you have someone who is has been in child welfare for 30 years in the largest child welfare protection agency in the country,
Right.
who is also a yogi in a way that wants to figure out how it is these intersect. And so I was allowed to write my thesis, and my thesis question really was, does yoga and mindfulness meditation in particular help to mitigate vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and secondary traumatic stress in child welfare workers? And the answer for me was yes. And it let me, they were so gracious, they let me come and write it from my own personal viewpoint, in that many times we get into these fields, and I would assume that this is the same in education, Sarah, and there's really no test as to what we can handle, right? Or what's going to come. We go, we learn, and yes, it is, and I do have a degree in social work, and yes, we do group counseling and group work and individual. And I did do my internship with the department, so I knew what I was getting into. But it didn't necessarily prepare me emotionally and spiritually for what, and physically, I think, to some extent, of what was really happening when I was listening to the stories of children.
Yeah.
And these were not stories, and I think, right, we see joy in many places, but particularly in child welfare, that is not the case. It is not to say that those moments don't arise, but I was an emergency worker for almost 15 years. And so I, receive a referral, I go out to your home, I don't know you at all. And I'm having to sort of hear, and you're sharing, so building that rapport, having that space, which I've always had. I don't believe it was your intention for this to happen in your day. I've always come through that lens, again, maybe coming from my own trauma, my own childhood, that I don't think that that was the intention of my parents, but it is what happened. And it allows me to be present. But what I didn't realize was that when I was leading or being an advocate, which I wanted to do for children, I was leading with that story.
Yes.
In all of its totality, because empathy requires me to lean in, right? I mean, we physically lean in with our body to listen and to hear. We also have to imagine. In this line of work, we have to imagine the scenario, what happened, who was there, how did it occur, because decisions need to be made, and they need to be made quickly. My brain, and the way that science shares with us, doesn't know the difference in the same way that we have our imagination, or you can reflect on a memory that, you can almost smell the ocean. So the brain is capturing all of this data and information, as well as all of the feeling that comes with this very tense situation.
Yes.
And even though we are sort of straddling the space of attempting to diffuse that, to not have it be so heightened. The reality is it's a very heightened situation. There's no doubt about it. Somebody coming to your door, whether that's law enforcement, the paramedics, or what have you. And so for many years, I didn't really know or was conscious of what that was doing. So not only having my own life experience, which all of us have, as great as your parents may be, there's always sort of something, right? Being overcritical, or maybe there was a financial something that we sort of carry into adulthood. And so when I got hired, I don't think anyone asked me about those things. I don't think they said, what was your own resiliency, or what kind of things did you overcome? Or, it was sort of like, great, like you have a degree, you've done your internship, we've trained you, and you've met all the criteria, which by all means, so grateful for that, foundation. But it didn't prepare me for that. It didn't prepare me, and no one was talking about it. I mean, right, child welfare is fairly new, right? I think maybe LA County was in the 80s when it was formed. So for an institution or agency, it's fairly new. I came into the county in the early 90s. So it was new. And so nobody, I don't know if people were aware, or again, when I was able to do my own thesis, I couldn't find study on child welfare workers, particularly because I think when we just almost don't want them to exist in society, yet we know that they do, and we know statistically the numbers for abused and neglected children. So I think that there's that, right? There's the stigma of that in our own families and in our own lives. And then we sort of walk into these professions having no idea what that toll, and I use the word right toll just as my own experience, is going to do. And I'm fortunate that there was a part of me, since a young age, that was so connected to spirit, that was connected to this transition of life and death and questioning, and would sit on mountains and journal, and ask big questions about life. That sort of kept me going and wondering and curious about the way it is that we were navigating. But I feel like, and I'm going to go back to, I wasn't necessarily prepared or had ways to engage both sides of my nervous system in order to continue this work. And so by the time yoga came, I had already been, let's see, maybe over 10 years working within child welfare in the department, and I didn't have any of those things. I mean, right? Like I didn't, understand that I needed rest. I didn't understand that I needed a space to be vulnerable and allowed to be vulnerable, that I also could grieve and be saddened by what was happening and what we were seeing. And I absolutely 100% understand how we show up in these spaces and almost armor up. And I don't mean that we're not compassionate, but that we sort of separate ourselves from what's happening in our own personal lives. But our personal lives are still existing. And we go into these spaces and we receive that. And then I leave your home. But I've taken that with me. Even though it may be resolved, I've taken it with me. And then the next house. And so for me, tens and thousands of children later, the stories of all of those children. And do I remember them all? No. But my body does. Because I've had to lean in, and because I came from that space of, I want to be an advocate and give children a voice that I didn't think I had, then it comes in that way where I want to hold the sacredness of that. Right? I want to honor that story because it was so difficult to share, or that you were able to have a voice to do that, and that I held that to be so sacred. And so I feel like I didn't have a way, and I didn't know what was happening until I became like what we see is depressed. I was so depressed, and I was crying, and I didn't want to go to work, and for us, it was these green folders that would be new cases. I didn't want to see any more green folders on my desk. And really questioned if this was for me. I really was like, I don't think that this is something that I can do anymore. I have the capacity for. And I threw my hands up in the air, literally, and said, God, if this is what you want me to keep doing, you have to figure out the way.
Yeah.
Right? I was just exhausted. And there wasn't anything particular that was happening, but I didn't realize what was happening.
Right.
And subsequently, I went inward, which is what I do, and said, what did you do? How did you get through these 10 years or these 30 years of life, right? Because it wasn't just being at work, but your life as a child. And it was to be quiet, but it was also to get back into this yogic practice, to start allowing myself to rest, to say, you know what, maybe you have reached your capacity. Maybe we are really at that space. That didn't happen, obviously. But it's really then that I thought, I really want to figure out what's going on. I really want to figure out the science behind it. I want to figure out if people are talking about it. And then it sort of exploded, and everybody was talking about compassion fatigue. Oh, social workers, teachers, right? And we started to have a conversation about it. But even in those conversations, I kept wondering, okay, but like I'm the healer, and you're telling me I need a self-help, right? I need self-care, but you're asking still me to do it. Right? Like, where do I find, like, right? If I'm trying to figure that out, but like, where am I supposed to get that? And I was happened to be blessed that I had time to do that, right? But I think, what if you don't have time? You kind of have work, and you've got kids, and you have a husband or not a husband, or whatever your situation is, or an ill child or an ill parent, that might not be that there for you. And it's really when I wanted to start getting into the actual agencies. That's actually what the deal is. Like, I want to begin to have these conversations, to acknowledge that it's happening, that it is an inevitable part of these jobs, that you are not, if you are an empathetic or a compassionate person, there's no way for you to not have some of that happen. And I didn't realize it was physically taking a toll on me until I had a friend of mine. She was studying to be her Thai massage, and she was giving me a massage, right? She was practicing, and I was like, yes, you can use me as a guinea pig, yes. And she hit a side of my hip, and I just began to weep. And we were in this room at my yoga studio at the time, and I just wept. And she was so amazing and just allowed me space to cry, right? Eyes were closed, and I really had to think about, what is that? Like, I thought I was going to come and get this kind of massage, and it would be great. And when the massage was over and the experience was over, and she and I were talking, I said, that is the place that I have been holding the sacred stories of children.
Yes.
Right? That I didn't even know that was the space. So when I was having whatever was happening in that space, and now we talk about the somatic experience. We talk about somatic therapy, because we understand better now that the body is receiving that. The body is hearing that, right? The imagery in the mind and in the brain, and how it is then we store that. And then, right, this idea of how do we release that? And I've thought a lot about that, Sarah. I'm not sure that we do. I think that it becomes in some way a part of us that we can lean into, and both things exist at the same time. Right?
Mm.
I think it's an acknowledgement of his existence, because I don't think that I can erase, right, all of what has happened, but I
Right.
can learn ways in which it is to lean in so that it no longer creates an imbalance. Does that
For
make sense? Like,
It does. For me, it's about no longer carrying the energy of it, but keeping the wisdom of it. So, what have I
mm,
learned
mm,
from this, right?
mhm,
But
mhm,
and that for me is also that space of forgiveness. And I choose to
mhm,
forgive because of how it changes me, not how it
mhm,
changes the other person. But
mhm,
in that space of forgiveness, I'm choosing to say, energetically, if I hold on to this diminishes my capacity. It diminishes who I am as a person. It diminishes my future if I hold on
mhm,
to this.
mhm,
I
mhm,
will keep the wisdom from what I've learned out of this
mhm,
very difficult situation, and I'm going to release the energy of it so that my light can shine again. Because if not, then the shoulders come forward, right? The solar
mhm,
plexus hides up,
mhm,
and it just
mhm.
becomes that look of that person is carrying a heavy weight.
And I feel like that's the message for child welfare workers and for
Mm.
those that work in environments of trauma. That, again, that we acknowledge that this is an absolute normal thing to happen. But what
Yes.
can we do? What ways can we serve ourselves so that we can move towards, again, this idea of abundance
Mhm.
and grace and compassion for ourselves, for, being human, uh, and trying it out like everyone else, right? I don't know how, I joke, but like, I don't know how to be human. I'm trying like everyone else.
Right.
Um, and that we acknowledge that, because I feel like those are the things where, I've been thinking about this idea of letting go, and thank you for the way that you phrase that, because I don't know that I want to let things go. In some ways, I want to um, learn different ways. I cannot, I've heard, especially in child welfare, right? So I'm just going to use it through that lens. Oh, right, we have to unlearn. And I
Mm.
don't know that we unlearn. I think we learn a different way, and then we make the decision to choose that way. And
Mhm.
that comes through, again, in our capacities of resilience. What did I learn from this experience? I don't want to take that experience away or let that go, in that,
Mhm.
because it still serves me to some capacity. And, I've struggled with this idea that in that letting go, I feel like I was letting go of me, this other person who was resilient and who was able to overcome some of those
Mhm.
challenges. And if I let go of the experience, I'm letting go of her. I'm letting go of her, and I need her still, because there's
Mhm.
still areas of my life that I need to explore and be curious about.
Mhm.
And she may have the answer. And I know that sounds kind of weird. I'm the same person, but those experiences are of a younger Angela or a child Angela. And I don't, right, if I let them go, and I understand the idea of it being harming, but I'm also attempting to reconcile and live in that space
Right.
and live with all of the experience, because then that allows also, I think, my brain, my actual brain,
Mhm.
right, to build new passages in new ways, right, to look at it through a different lens of compassion, or look at it through a different lens of something else that I have learned along my journey. And we know that compassion fatigue in particular really is in the brain. We get that the spaces, especially our amygdala, that
Mhm.
space in our brain for fight, flight, or freeze, is the same space where it is we engage empathy. And if
Yes.
we do that too long, and we, again, these kind of idea of both things simultaneously happening,
Mhm.
I need the rest space.
Yes.
So, when, especially again, child welfare, that is the space we're living in, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. We've got to figure it out. And these are really dangerous situations at times.
Right.
But if I'm not practicing the other part that engages that same part of the brain, then my response is always going to be the alarmist.
Mm.
right? The alarm that goes off in my amygdala, absolutely need it for survival. But
Right.
again, moving from survival to abundance, moving
Yes.
from scarcity to abundance or love and grace. And,
Yes.
and I need both. And
Mhm.
that's why I think this practice is so important
Mm.
um, because we need both in order for us to feel sometimes balanced. And I always use that word too, by the way, balance. I'm not sure that we're ever going to be really balanced. It's almost, I feel
Yes.
like sometimes balance is like the word perfect, it's perfectionism.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist.
Mhm.
Right? It robs us of joy in many
Mhm.
ways. And so I kind of feel like we're not going to always be balanced, but we might be more whole,
Mm.
right?
I
We
see,
might. Mm-hmm,
I see it that we're in flow, right? And if I
mm-hmm,
think about the streams that I've been next to, even when I was next to the Congo River, that there would be these eddies, this place where there'd be backflow, or that you could watch a leaf, go into a circle, right? Kind of a
mm-hmm,
thing. And then all of a sudden the leaf would release somehow. Just enough water would flow, and that the leaf would then be on its merry way again. And so for me, I see it, I agree with you about balance. If
mm-hmm,
my focus is on how balanced I can be, I am missing the beauty of life because I'm so hyper focused on is this in balance or not.
mm-hmm,
But if
mm-hmm,
I'm much more in the space of flow, then I'm able to say, oh, this can come off of my plate for the time being, or I can allow this to release, and maybe it'll come back at another point in my life.
mm-hmm,
I can
mm-hmm,
feel
mm-hmm,
the grief of things that I would love for them to continue on longer. I can feel the grief of that, knowing that in this space and time that that's coming to an end. But yet in the space of flow, there's a possibility that that thing that I so loved will come back maybe in a different form, a different way. Um, and so that's how I I wrote a book and I used the word balance in there a lot. And after I published the book, I was like, oh, I think flow would have been a better way of doing it, because flow also means movement.
mm-hmm,
Balance to me, yes, there's a sense of movement to it. But when I was teaching and we had the little balances and we got, the right number of teddy
mm-hmm.
bears on one side and the right number of paper clips on the other, the movement stopped. It was in balance. And so I think that life has a lot of movement to it.
100%. I think that I agree. This idea that of stagnation, right? That we are just this one thing. We're messy and we're complicated. And again, we don't have all the answers. We're trying to figure them out and hopefully be curious. And I do think
Yes.
that is a pillar of resiliency, is being
Yes.
curious and
Yes.
on some level having hope. And what I mean by that is that an imagination in some ways, because I think as a child, particularly in children that we work with, we always say, oh, children are resilient. And I think because children are curious. They're really hopeful. They kind of, even in dire situations, they imagine, I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to grow up. I'm going to move away. I'm going to, oh, all right, I'm going to be an astronaut. I'm going to do whatever. And
Right.
that is what propels them to sort of move to the next thing that they need to move through. And they do definitely need adults and they need people in their lives. But that doesn't necessarily end when we are not children.
Right.
Right? Human beings are enormously resilient in that we have the capacities to flow. We have the capacities to be curious, to um, hope in ways that
Mm.
allow us for a moment to think of an alternative. And so maybe we try it, which goes back to faith. Maybe we take that leap of faith and maybe we don't, or maybe it comes around again, or maybe we don't. But
Mhm.
this idea of we have to have it perfect. And again,
Mhm.
I think, going back to child welfare, it's such a strong message in
Mm.
that organization that it doesn't allow us to kind of have failure. And part of our learning process is doing that. And so when I go and I talk to healers, I bring that up, especially somebody who still works within the department. I feel like I offer a different voice. I'm one of you. And I understand where you're at or maybe where you've been, but it's okay every now and then to not know or to be overwhelmed or to cry. You know, we're not allowed to do that in our professions, right? Because everything needs to be, but there's an enormous amount of grief and abandonment and shifting of policies and classes. And all right, I would imagine, like you shared, you know, when all of a sudden, you know, you have to park at a different lot. Many times our staff is relocated or they get a different supervisor, you know, or they have to shift caseloads.
Right.
And there's grief that we don't also get to express. And so it's, for me, it's giving them that space and saying, we're all those things, and we're formidable, and we're knowledgeable, and we're intelligent, and we're empathetic and compassionate, and we're a hot mess, you know, too, right? And we're funny, and we're all of these things, and not to get caught up in the label of it. And that I have always shared that I am very fortunate, Sarah, that my life turned out and I got to do the thing I wanted to do. And I know that that doesn't happen for a lot of people. But it didn't come just easily as some people may imagine that it did. It came with a lot of challenges and difficulties in ways that I'm not sure that sometimes I wonder how I made it at all. Most people don't know, but my parents were teenagers when they had me and were able to get married and live alone with me. I often wonder, like, oh, yeah, I was 16. My mother was 16 and my father was 17. And the challenges that come with that and came with that for both of them in their own lives. But I think about how those moments, right, shaped me, and how I don't have all the answers, right? This was my karmic life, perhaps, as I was supposed to be. But, and again, nature versus nurture, I don't know, to come into this field. But I've always felt that this was the work that I was called to do. And I was gifted to be able to have a job and do the work. Right? So the work was within that job. And I share with people sometimes when we are sort of finding difficulty in wherever space we are in our employment, or, you know, that I have to ask myself, am I doing the work that I have been called to do? And perhaps for a season and a time, this isn't that, right? It is a means that I need, right? I have to pay, again, I always go back to pay a mortgage, feed the babies. Right. But I need to continue to do the work because that is what fuels my soul. And so for many social workers, many people who work in child welfare, they believe this is a calling, that this is right. But in that calling, Sarah, they believe that they must sacrifice because society tells us you have to sacrifice for children, right? And I get that. But to what extent? Right? Like there has to be a part of us that fills our own cup with compassion, fills our own cup with grace and forgiveness to be able to continue to do the work that we have all been called to do. And again, as a healer and somebody who wants to heal healers, I think about that. I have to set back when things are overwhelming, or maybe I'm having, you know, I'm spiraling into some thought. I have to, again, I retreat inward. My practice has taught that, to retreat inward, to be still, to just breathe, to notice that I'm alive, and that somehow it's going to be okay because it always has been. Right? Resiliency, this idea of accepting my own resilient space, is saying, I got this. Right? It might be a little messy, or it might, you know, not seem to be conforming to what everyone might think it should be, but I've got this. I just need a moment. I need a moment to figure out once again, what is the work and what is the task?
Angela, as we are coming to the close of this, I think that we'll have multiple conversations in the future. What is something that you want to reiterate for our audience? Because you just carry such wisdom and you're able to weave things together so beautifully. What is a gem that you would like for our listeners to hold on to?
I I I definitely think that healing is a journey. It is not a destination, and I feel like many times we have sold it that way. I jokingly say that I'm going to write a book about my life, and I'm not going to give the title, but I will give the premise. Is that I've bought many books, and I have been in many seminars, and have done many things, and each promises healing. And
Right.
it doesn't mean that I am not healed in some way,
Right.
but that is not the end of my journey, right? My journey of healing isn't necessarily even from traumatic experience. It can be for things in which it is I have created in my own mind or in my own spirit. And
Mhm.
so I think that to remain curious, and that when we have these practices, that we can practice empathy, practice compassion, that it leads to a life and a lens of abundance instead of scarcity. And many times for child welfare workers, those that work in fields of trauma, scarcity is the norm. It is concept. There's not enough workers, or there's not enough money, or there's not enough. And we are enough. We are that. We
Right.
are what is enough.
Yes.
And that then lies in abundance. That if each of us, right, and I can go on, but if each of us can settle into our own selves and figure out what is the work that
Mhm.
I have been asked to do, then I think that we live a better life of abundance, not just for ourselves, but for everyone.
Mm. A friend put it this way: enough is freedom. And there is just such depth to that. I've spent a number of months just thinking about that enough is freedom. And you are right. There is this space of abundance. We have enough air and more than what we need to be able to breathe. And there is space for us to be able to be quiet and to rest. Angela, I have loved this conversation. Thank you so much for carving out time for it. And please come back again.
Yeah, for sure.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.